Welcome to a story that would grip an entire city in fear and leave a scar on the soul of a community. A case steeped in tragedy, controversy, and unanswered questions. This is the story of the Atlanta child murders, an unsolved nightmare that continues to haunt the streets of Georgia's capital. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and this is Unsolved Cases by Skoob. Picture Atlanta in the late 1970s, a city at a cultural crossroads, a beacon of Black excellence, political progress, and Southern pride. With a Black mayor, a Black public safety commissioner, and a bold new image of racial unity, Atlanta was determined to show the world that the New South had arrived. "Let's keep pulling together, Atlanta," the slogan read. But as the city projected hope, darkness crept into its neighborhoods. It started quietly. A missing boy, then another, and another. Children, Black children, disappearing without a trace. Some were found days later, their lives brutally ended. Others were never found at all. As the bodies piled up, fear set in, followed by frustration, then outrage. This wasn't just a crime spree. It was a test of justice. And for many, the system failed. Police struggled, leads went cold, and the media shaped a narrative that often ignored the voices of those crying the loudest, the mothers, fathers, and neighbors of the victims. For years, Atlanta lived in a state of terror, as suspicion blanketed the city and trust in law enforcement withered. Eventually, a man was arrested, Wayne Williams, tried and convicted, but not for the murders of the children that sparked the panic. To this day, many believe the real killer, or killers, may still be out there. But before we explore the evidence, the theories, and the deep scars left behind, we have to go back to the beginning, to the summer of '79, to a young boy named Edward Hope Smith, to a city that was about to be changed forever. July 28, 1979. A phone call comes into Atlanta police about a disturbing smell in the woods near Niskey Lake Road. When officers arrived, they discovered something that would haunt them for years to come. The body of Alfred Evans, just 13 years old, missing for 3 days. The medical examiner's conclusion was grim, likely strangled. But Alfred wasn't alone in those woods. Not far away, in the same patch of earth, lay the partially decomposed remains of 14-year-old Edward Smith, who had vanished 4 days before Alfred. Edward's death was different, though, definitively shot with a .22 caliber weapon. 2 Black children, found in the same location, but killed in completely different ways. The investigators couldn't have known it then, but they were staring at the beginning of something unprecedented. November 8th brought another discovery that should have set off alarm bells. 9-year-old Yusuf Bell, missing since late October, was found in an abandoned school, strangled, just like Alfred Evans. Just over a week later, 14-year-old Milton Harvey's body was discovered near Redwine Road and Desert Drive in East Point. Milton had been missing since early September, months before his body was found. The cause of death? Undetermined. Another Black child, another death, another family destroyed. But here's the thing that's almost incomprehensible looking back. Despite these obvious similarities, there wasn't enough evidence to link the cases. In a city as large as Atlanta, children unfortunately go missing regularly. Some are later found deceased. The police treated these as isolated incidents. The system was failing these children before their killer even had a chance to strike again. March 5th, 1980. 12-year-old Angel Lanner left for school and never made it. 5 days later, her small body was found on the side of a road, bound and gagged with an electrical cord. She had been strangled. In a detail that would puzzle investigators, despite her underwear being intact, another pair had been stuffed into her mouth. The medical examiner found no signs of sexual assault. Then, March 12th, 11-year-old Jeffrey Mathis disappeared. By this point, 6 Black children were dead or missing. 6. And still, The Atlanta Police Department hadn't connected these cases. The differences seemed to outweigh the similarities in their minds. Different causes of death, different locations, different circumstances. But while the police failed to see the pattern, someone else did. Someone whose child was among the victims. April 15th, 1980, a date that should be remembered as a turning point. Camille Bell, mother of murdered 9-year-old Yusuf Bell, along with other parents of missing and murdered black children, formed the Committee to Stop Children's Murders. These mothers and fathers, living through every parent's worst nightmare, were the first to officially recognize what law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't see: that their children were being hunted. They appealed for official support and recognition of the crisis unfolding around them. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was systematic. This was a pattern. This was a predator at work. But the killing didn't stop. May 19th brought Eric Middlebrook, 14 years old, found murdered near his home, suffering blunt force trauma to the head. June 9th, Christopher Richardson, 12, disappeared. June 22nd, 8-year-old LaTanya Wilson was abducted from her bedroom, taken from what should have been the safest place in the world for a child. 2 days later, 10-year-old Aaron Weitch's body was found beneath a DeKalb County bridge. Cause of death: asphyxia and a broken neck. July 6th, 9-year-old Anthony Tony Carter was discovered behind a Wells Street warehouse, stabbed multiple times. His small body clearly moved after death. The city was hemorrhaging its children. And still, official recognition of the crisis lagged behind the mounting body count. Let me take you inside one case that would prove crucial to eventually solving this nightmare: the murder of Eric Middlebrooks. Picture this. A 14-year-old boy receives a phone call at his mother's house one evening. After a brief conversation, Middlebrooks grabbed his bicycle and left quickly. He never returned home. The next day, his body was found in an alleyway behind a bar. At first glance, Middlebrooks' murder seemed different from the others. He died from blunt force trauma, not strangulation, like many of the other victims. His body wasn't discarded in a deserted forest or wooded area like we'd seen before. But look closer, and you'll see the connections. Eric Middlebrooks was a black male under 18, known for spending considerable time on Atlanta's streets. Like many of the other victims, he made pocket money by performing various tasks around the neighborhood, mending bicycles, doing odd jobs. This brought him into contact with a wide range of people, some with criminal pasts and questionable characters. But here's what made Eric's case particularly puzzling. He was arguably more streetwise than many of the other victims. He was larger in size, a capable kid who knew Atlanta well. This suggested that his murder involved either multiple assailants, a surprise attack, or that somehow the killer had gained Eric's trust. This is where our story takes a crucial turn, because at Eric Middlebrooks' crime scene, something extraordinary happened. An observant Atlanta PD crime scene detective named Bob Buffington, who was knowledgeable about the emerging field of fiber analysis, made a discovery that would eventually help crack this case wide open. On the sole of Eric's shoe, Detective Buffington found an unusual red fiber. Now, this was 1980. Forensic investigators lacked modern technologies like DNA profiling. They could analyze fingerprints and test blood for basic types, roughly match hairs. But these methods could only help rule out certain individuals or provide additional evidence against those who matched. They couldn't conclusively identify someone like DNA can today. But fiber analysis, that was gaining acceptance in law enforcement. It involved examining fibers found at crime scenes and comparing them with potential source materials like carpets or rugs. The method required having a suspect to be truly effective, but collecting every piece of evidence at a crime scene was critical for later matching a suspect to the scene. That unusual red fiber on Eric Middlebrooks' shoe would prove to be one of the most important pieces of evidence in this entire case. While investigators were slowly beginning to piece together forensic evidence, The community itself was transforming under the weight of fear and frustration. Let me tell you about Jeffrey Mathis, not just as a victim, but as a real child with a real life. In school photographs, you can see 11-year-old Jeffrey in a t-shirt resembling a child-sized football jersey, sporting a slightly crooked smile. His reputation was that of a bright, resilient, and autonomous individual. But as a black boy in Atlanta, Jeffrey was often unjustly labeled as a hopeless case, beyond protection or discipline. His mother, Willie Mae, worked as a maid raising 6 children. His father, William, had been a security guard at a cemetery before being killed in a robbery years earlier. The Atlanta child murders were being represented by the media, and even by officials, as involving delinquents and runaways from dysfunctional homes. This was the summer of 1980, when CNN, the first 24-hour news network, launched right in the middle of this crisis. The constant media coverage wasn't just reporting the story, it was shaping the narrative. The city's class divide, particularly among black residents, was evident in both the portrayal of the victims and the perceived indifference their families felt as children continued to disappear. The disjointed response from law enforcement was officially attributed to a lack of coordination among agencies. But residents from the affected neighborhoods saw it as something else entirely: disregard. The fear was becoming palpable. When an explosion at a daycare center in the Bowen Homes projects killed 4 children and a teacher, rumors immediately circulated that the incidents were linked, that there might be a white supremacist attack underway. The explosion was later determined to be from a malfunctioning boiler, but the fact that people's minds immediately went to organized racial violence tells you everything about the state of fear in the community. Willie Mae Mathis became a founding member of the Committee to Stop Children's Murders. This group of activist mothers worked tirelessly, not just to advocate for their murdered children, but to counteract Mayor Jackson's depiction of the missing children as street children from broken, welfare-dependent homes. The truth these mothers fought to expose was different. Many of the murdered children were part of gifted student programs. They were trying to make money legitimately through odd jobs and neighborhood work. These weren't throwaway kids. These were beloved children from families doing their best in difficult circumstances. The activist mothers were later accused of criminal and civil misconduct due to poor fundraising practices, which they attributed to inexperience. Meanwhile, Mayor Jackson, who wanted to present Atlanta as a city of opportunity and progress, found the murders of poor black children a hindrance to promoting Atlanta's image as a cultural and commercial hub. The community began to take matters into its own hands. Neighborhood vigilantes mobilized in the spirit of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Children were no longer allowed to play outside. A citywide curfew was implemented. The city was living in fear and anger. It wasn't until the community was already transformed by terror that an FBI task force was finally assigned to the case. President Ronald Reagan appointed Vice President George H.W. Bush to guide federal and local efforts. But for the mothers who had been screaming for help, for the families who had watched their children disappear into a void of official indifference, this response felt like too little, too late. Behind the scenes, while the community grappled with fear and the media shaped narratives, forensic experts were making connections that would eventually break this case wide open. A consulting team was brought in to analyze the evidence, and their initial findings were stunning. After reviewing the cases, they concluded that the same individual was responsible for at least 23 of the 27 murders on their list. The cases that seemed most interconnected included Jimmy Payne, William Barrett, Larry Rogers, Patrick Baltazar, Luby Gator, Terry Pugh, Charles Stevens, Eric Middlebrooks, and Alfred Evans. What linked them? Consistent similarities. The same fibers and animal hairs found across multiple crime scenes. Other victims, both male and female, were discovered in the same vicinity as these 9 primary victims, mostly along the same roads and rivers. Even though they were likely strangled, there wasn't definitive evidence linking their deaths to the 9 principal victims. Yet it was too early in the investigation to exclude them. The consulting team believed the probability was high that the same person murdered 23, if not all 27 of the victims. But they also noted a crucial limitation. They couldn't find strong reasons to link all 27 murders due to either incomplete investigations of the early victims or insufficient data from the Atlanta Task Force. Here's where the case took a fascinating turn in terms of criminal profiling. The murder method, victims predominantly asphyxiated and disappearing from areas frequented by young African Americans, did not align with the widely propagated theory of a white racist individual or group targeting Atlanta's black children to incite fear. These murders didn't fit the political definition of terrorism. Instead, it was more probable that the Atlanta child murders were committed by a black male with a hands-on approach to his victims, both before and after death. Think about it. Such a killer would blend in. He would have community connections. He wouldn't arouse suspicion. He would be trusted by his victims. The consulting team concluded that the killer was likely a community member, someone who operated like Ted Bundy, appearing harmless, trustworthy, someone whose victims had no inkling they were in danger. This profile would prove to be remarkably accurate. The breakthrough in this case came from an unexpected source, a stakeout of bridges around Atlanta. Investigators had noticed that several victims' bodies had been disposed of in rivers and waterways, so they began monitoring bridge crossings. This surveillance would eventually lead to Wayne Williams, a 23-year-old black man who became the prime suspect and was ultimately convicted for 2 of the murders. But Williams was never formally charged with most of the child murders. Instead, the prosecution used a legal strategy that would become central to his trial. In the trial against Wayne Williams, the judge made a crucial decision that permitted evidence from other murders for which Williams was not formally charged, to be introduced during the proceedings. The judge allowed the prosecution to present evidence from 10 other murders linked to the Atlanta child murders as part of a strategy to establish a recurring pattern of behavior. These additional murders were called pattern cases or pattern murders. While this might seem controversial, using evidence from crimes someone isn't formally charged with, the practice of using evidence from uncharged crimes to illustrate a pattern is not unusual in American legal proceedings. Among the 10 victims used as pattern evidence were Alfred Evans and Eric Middlebrooks. Remember that crucial red carpet fiber found on Eric's shoe? Charles Stevens, a 12-year-old who went missing on October 9, 1980, was included. His cause of death was suffocation. 15-year-old Terry Pugh, who disappeared on January 22, 1981, and was later found strangled. John Porter, the oldest victim allowed as pattern evidence at 28 years old, who died from stab wounds in April 1981. The prosecution argued that all 10 victims shared a common profile that supported their assertion of a pattern. The characteristics they outlined painted a chilling picture of deliberate victim selection. All victims were black males, predominantly children, but even those classified as adults were relatively young, with the oldest being 28. Despite some juvenile victims having athletic builds, the adults were mostly of short stature with small builds, typically averaging below 5 feet 6 inches and under 150 pounds. This demographic closely matched Williams's own size or smaller. Another grim commonality was that nearly all victims were discovered nude. According to both the prosecution and crime profilers, this nudity served a dual purpose: a pragmatic attempt to destroy physical evidence and a signature act reflecting possible sexual dominance or activities conducted with the bodies before disposal. The absence of personal vehicles among the 10 victims emerged as another crucial detail. The prosecution proposed that Williams, like many serial predators, targeted vulnerabilities. His ability to offer rides was a cornerstone of his modus operandi. The prosecution also highlighted a pattern in the crime scenes. Most victims were murdered in one location and then transported to a separate site for disposal. This movement of bodies was considered integral to Williams' operational pattern, reinforcing the claim of consistent, methodical behavior. But before Wayne Williams became the focus, investigators pursued several other theories that reflected the chaos and desperation of the investigation. One of the most elaborate theories involved a supposed pedophile network operated by influential figures within Atlanta's African American community. The theory proposed that individuals within the black business sector, along with certain government officials, were paying young male offenders to abduct black children from Atlanta's streets. According to this theory, these abducted children were brought to network members, subjected to abuse and murder, and then returned to the abductors for body disposal in forests and rivers around Atlanta. However, this theory was supported by nothing more than ambiguous street gossip. The theory gained temporary momentum with the discovery of 23-year-old Michael McIntosh's body in a local river in late March 1981. Despite his age, McIntosh was added to the victim list because his murder matched the killer's modus operandi. Young and physically petite, McIntosh was found naked, and the autopsy confirmed he was strangled like most other victims. McIntosh's criminal history led investigators to explore the pedophile ring theory more seriously. Most of his crimes were property-related, but he lived on society's fringe, associated with dubious criminal figures. Like other adult victims, McIntosh was a drug addict and heavy drinker known to engage in prostitution. One of his acquaintances provided intriguing information, claiming McIntosh might have been killed by people who had employed him. This person detailed the supposed functioning of the pedophile network, suggesting McIntosh was paid to kidnap young boys for the group and dispose of bodies. The theory was that McIntosh was murdered because he knew too much. The task force pursued this theory extensively, with many investigators initially believing it. However, it was ultimately abandoned due to lack of evidence linking McIntosh to any members of Atlanta's elite black society. Apart from one dubious informant, no evidence was discovered suggesting the existence of such a pedophile network. The theory of an organized pedophile ring, like earlier theories of clan involvement, proved to be another misleading dead end in a case that was becoming increasingly complex and politically charged. What ultimately made the case against Wayne Williams was the accumulation of fiber evidence, particularly that red fiber found on Eric Middlebrooks' shoe by Detective Bob Buffington. Much of the fiber and hair evidence against Williams came from those uncharged pattern cases, which is why the judge's decision to allow pattern evidence was so crucial to the prosecution's strategy. The fibers found across multiple crime scenes created a web of physical evidence that was difficult to explain away. The forensic evidence suggested a methodical killer who maintained contact with victims both before and after death. Someone who transported bodies to disposal sites. Someone who fit the profile the consulting team had developed. A community member who could gain victims' trust. Williams was ultimately convicted, but questions remained. The case highlighted the intersection of race, class, media representation, and criminal justice in ways that continue to resonate today. The families of victims who weren't part of the formal charges against Williams never received the closure of seeing their children's killer formally prosecuted for those specific murders. The Committee to Stop Children's Murders, formed by grieving mothers who refused to let their children become forgotten statistics, had forced the system to pay attention. These mothers, led by women like Camille Bell and Willie Mae Mathis, had recognized the pattern before law enforcement did. They had demanded action when officials were content to treat these as isolated incidents. Their activism challenged both the official narrative and the media portrayal of their children as disposable delinquents. They insisted their children be seen as what they were: beloved sons and daughters, students, children trying to earn honest money, children who deserved protection and justice. The Atlanta child murders case remains one of the most complex and controversial in American criminal history. It exposed how systemic failures, from initial police response to media coverage, can compound tragedy. It showed how quickly fear can transform a community, and how class and racial dynamics can influence both the investigation and public perception of victims. The case also demonstrated the power of forensic science in its early applications. That red fiber found by Detective Buffington represented a new era in criminal investigation. But it also showed the limitations of the system, where many families never saw formal justice for their specific losses. Perhaps most importantly, it revealed the strength of community organizing in the face of official indifference. The mothers who formed the committee to stop children's murders didn't just advocate for their own children. They fought to change how society viewed young black victims of violence. They refused to let their children be dismissed as throwaways from broken homes. They demanded recognition that these were precious lives cut short, that each death represented not just a statistic, but a universe of potential destroyed. Today, when we look back at the Atlanta child murders, we see more than just a serial killer case. We see a moment when a community's children were under siege, when the systems meant to protect them failed, and when the people who loved them most had to fight not just for justice, but for the basic recognition that their children's lives mattered. The woods near Niskey Lake Road, where Alfred Evans and Edward Smith were found on that July day in 1979, started a chain of events that would forever change Atlanta. But it also started a movement of mothers who refused to be silent, who demanded better for their children, and who ultimately forced a reckoning with how society treats its most vulnerable members. Their fight continues today, in every community where children go missing, where families demand answers, where the powerful prefer silence to justice. The legacy of the Atlanta child murders isn't just about solving crimes. It's about never forgetting that behind every victim is a family that deserves truth, justice, and the simple recognition that their child's life had immeasurable value. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the Atlanta child murders. To learn more about the suspects, the ongoing efforts to seek justice, and more, download the Skoob app on the App Store or Play Store and unlock exclusive content from Unsolved Cases. Until next time, I'm Larry Hunter. Stay vigilant, stay compassionate,